the High Plains wind of 1887, carried no promises, only the fine red dust of West Texas and the scent of sagebrush baking under an indifferent sun. It was a wind that scoured the paint from buildings, cracked a man's lips, and whispered of distances that could swallow a soul whole. At the heart of this unforgiving expanse lay the town of Redemption, a name more hopeful than descriptive. Its single street was a scar of trampled earth, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached structures, a general store, a saloon, whose piano had long surrendered to the climate, a livery, and the squat stone-built bank. Presiding over this fragile outpost of civilization was the sheriff's office, and inside a man who understood the hollowness of names better than most. Sheriff Jake Callahan was a man carved from the same harsh landscape as the town he served. His face was a roadmap of past sorrows, with lines etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. He had come to Redemption, seeking quiet, a place where the ghosts of his former life as a U.S. Marshal might finally grow faint. But ghosts have long memories. The morning of the robbery began with an unnatural stillness. The usual clamor of commerce was muted, the air, thick and heavy, pressing down like a judgment. Jake felt it in his bones, a low hum of dread that had been his companion for years. He sat at his desk, the scarred oak, a testament to his predecessors, and stared at the object that anchored him to a life he had lost, a small silver locket. It was unadorned, its surface worn smooth by the constant touch of his thumb. Inside, behind a tiny pane of glass, was a miniature portrait of his wife, Eleanor, her smile a beacon from a world that no longer existed. He traced its delicate outline, a ritual of remembrance that both soothed and sharpened his grief. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness, each second a hammer blow against the silence. It was just past 10. Then the silence shattered. It began not with a bang, but with a chilling, orchestrated precision. Two riders entered town from the east, and their movements unhurried, almost casual. They dismounted and took positions across from the bank, rifles held loosely but ready. A moment later, a wagon rattled up the street from the west, its driver's face obscured by the shadow of his hat. It stopped directly in front of the bank's doors, blocking the view from the sheriff's office. It was a perfectly timed maneuver, simple and brutally effective. Jake was on his feet before the wagon's wheels had stopped turning. "Deputy," he barked, his voice cutting through the office's dusty air. A young man named Billy, barely 20, and still possessing the earnest belief that a badge could stop a bullet, scrambled out from the back room. "Sheriff." "Trouble?" Jake set his voice flat. He strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight a cold comfort. "Stay here. Keep your head down." He didn't wait for a reply. He was already moving, slipping out the back door and into the alley that ran behind the main street. The plan was textbook: circle around, get a clear line of sight, and surprise them. But as he pressed himself against the rough-hewn wall of the general store, peering around the corner, he knew this was anything but textbook. The leader emerged from the wagon. He was a tall man dressed in a black duster that seemed to absorb the fierce sunlight. He moved with a liquid grace that was unnerving in a man of his size, his steps measured and confident. He wasn't a common bandit. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of violence. This was Silas Kane. Kane didn't shout or brandish his pistol. He walked to the bank's door and rapped his knuckles against the wood, a polite, almost gentlemanly sound. When the clerk opened it, Kane smiled a chilling expression, devoid of warmth, and stepped inside. Two more of his men followed, shotguns at the ready. Inside the bank, the scene unfolded with terrifying speed. Kane's voice was calm, articulate, cutting through the teller's panicked gasps. "Good morning, gentlemen. This is a transaction, not a massacre. The outcome depends entirely on your cooperation." He gestured to one of his men, who began methodically emptying the cash drawers into a burlap sack. The other kept his shotgun trained on the 3 employees and 2 customers who were frozen with a primal fear. But Silas Kane wasn't interested in the cash. His gaze swept the room and settled on the door to the manager's office where the safe was kept. He didn't need to force his way in. The manager, a portly man named Henderson, with sweat beading on his bald head, stumbled forward with the key. While his men worked, Kane moved with a strange, deliberate purpose. He walked through the bank as if he were appraising a property, his eyes missing nothing. Then he did something that made no sense. He walked directly out of the bank, leaving his men to finish, and strode across the street, straight toward the sheriff's office. From his vantage point, Jake watched his blood running cold. This was wrong. All of it. Robbers didn't leave the score. They didn't stroll through a town in broad daylight as if they owned it. Billy, watching from the front window, saw Kane approaching. Panic seized him. He raised his rifle, its barrel trembling. Billy knew Jake's whispered command was lost in the wind. The young deputy fired. The shot went wide, splintering the wooden post of the saloon's porch. It was the mistake Silas Kane had been waiting for. With a speed that defied his calm demeanor, Kane drew his own pistol, a silver-plated Colt that gleamed in the sun. He didn't aim at the window where the shot had come from. He aimed lower. A single deafening crack echoed down the street. The window of the general store beside Jake exploded, showering him with glass. It was a warning shot, impossibly precise. It said, "I know you're there." Gun smoke filled the air. Glass shattered. Jake hit the floor. The carefully planned ambush had turned into a trap, and he was the one caught in it. Across the street, Kane's men emerged from the bank's sacks of money slung over their shoulders. They moved to their horses with practiced ease, their job done. But Silas Kane wasn't finished. He walked into the now empty sheriff's office. Jake heard the creak of the door, the soft thud of Kane's boots on the floorboards. He was inside alone with Billy. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He pushed himself up, ignoring the sting of glass shards in his arm, and prepared to charge across the street. But no second shot came. Instead, after a long, agonizing minute, Silas Kane walked out. He held no gun, no sack of money. In his gloved hand, he held something small and silver. He held it up for Jake to see the sunlight catching its polished surface. It was the locket. Kane gave a slight mocking bow in Jake's direction, then mounted his horse. His eyes, cold and dark, met Jake's across the dusty expanse. He said nothing, but his smile spoke volumes. "This is not about money, Sheriff. This is about you." The gang spurred their horses and galloped out of town, leaving behind a cloud of red dust, a terrified populace, and a sheriff whose world had just been torn open anew. Jake sprinted across the street, his pistol drawn. But they were already gone, their silhouettes shrinking against the vast, empty horizon. He burst into his office. Billy was alive, pressed into a corner, shaking but unharmed. The office was untouched, save for one thing. On his desk in the center of a stack of paperwork lay a single pristine white feather, and beside it an empty space where the locket had been. The hollow in the wood felt like a fresh grave. The robbery, the money, the town's fear, it was all a smokescreen. This was a message delivered with surgical cruelty. Silas Kane had not come to rob redemption. He had come to rob Jake Callahan of his last connection to the past, to the woman whose memory was the only thing holding him together. The hunt was no longer about the law. It was about reclaiming a soul. The sun beat down on redemption, but for Jake a deeper cold had set in. The ghosts he had tried to outrun had finally caught up, and they wore the smiling face of Silas Kane. The dust settled, but the silence that fell over redemption was heavier than before, laced with the metallic tang of fear. Townspeople emerged from their hiding places like prairie dogs after a hawk has passed their faces pale, their eyes wide. They gathered in hushed groups, their murmurs a low thrum of anxiety. They looked to the sheriff's office seeking an anchor in the storm, but the man inside was adrift on a sea of his own. Jake stood motionless, staring at the empty spot on his desk. The wood grain seemed to mock him, a permanent scar where Eleanor's face had once offered solace. The stolen money was a civic problem. The stolen locket was a desecration. It was a violation so profound it left him breathless. He had built a fortress of solitude and duty around the fragile memory of his wife, and Silas Kane had breached it with contemptuous ease. His past roared back to life, the years he'd spent as a U.S. Marshal chasing men through unforgiving territories, his hands stained with the grim necessities of the law. He had been a different man, then harder, faster, fueled by a righteous fire that had long since cooled to embers. He'd left that life behind after Eleanor's death, trading his marshal's star for a local sheriff's badge, hoping the quiet routine of a town like Redemption would be a kind of penance. He had been a fool to think he could escape what he had done, who he had been. The West never forgot, and it never forgave. Clara Mayhew heard the gunshot from her schoolhouse at the edge of town. The single room filled with the scent of chalk dust and old paper was her sanctuary. Here she was not the quiet, solitary woman the town whispered about, but a figure of gentle authority guiding the children of redemption through the mysteries of letters and numbers. She was respected for her intelligence and her unwavering dedication, yet an invisible wall separated her from the rest of the town. They saw her resilience, but could not guess at the private sorrow that fueled it, a sorrow she kept locked away as securely as Jake kept his locket. When the shot rang out, her first instinct was to protect the children. She calmly directed them under their desks, her voice a steady balm against their rising fear. She stood by the window, peering out at the cloud of dust kicked up by the departing riders. She saw the panic, the chaos, and then she saw Sheriff Callahan standing alone in the middle of the street, a figure of profound isolation. A strange pang of recognition went through her. She understood that kind of loneliness. Her own past was a fractured thing. She spoke little of her family, only that they were gone. The townspeople assumed they had been lost to sickness or hardship, common enough tragedies on the frontier. The truth was more complicated. She carried the memory of a beloved younger brother, a wild-spirited boy named Thomas, who had run off years ago after a bitter falling out with their father. He had vanished into the vastness of the West, and for years a letter had been her only connection until the letters stopped coming. The silence he left behind was a constant aching void in her life, a wound that had never properly healed. Later that afternoon, after the children had been sent home to their worried parents, Clara walked into the center of town. She carried a basket containing a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of broth, an offering of comfort she often made to those in need. She found Jake in his office, the air still thick with the smell of gun smoke and stale coffee. He was cleaning his pistol with methodical, almost violent motions, his knuckles white. She set the basket on the corner of his desk, near the damning white feather. "Sheriff," she said softly. Jake didn't look up. "Miss Mayhew," his voice was gravel. "I heard what happened. Is everyone—" "Everyone's alive." He cut in his tone sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't want pity. He didn't want comfort. He wanted the locket. Clara did not retreat. She looked at the raw grief etched on his face, a grief so potent it was almost a physical presence in the room. She knew that look. She had seen it in her own reflection for years. They say the men who did this, they say their leader took something from you, something personal. Finally, Jake's hands stilled. He raised his head, and his eyes met hers. For a moment, the wall he kept around himself cracked, and she saw the raw, wounded man beneath the badge. "He took everything that mattered," he said, his voice barely a whisper. An understanding passed between them, silent and profound. They were two lonely souls, each nursing a private sorrow, recognizing in the other a shared capacity for loss. Clara simply nodded. "The town is scared, Sheriff. They're looking to you." Her words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact, a reminder of the duty that still bound him to this place. It was the anchor he needed. The rage coiling in his gut began to untangle, solidifying into cold, hard resolve. He wasn't just a grieving husband anymore. He was the law. "They can be scared," Jake said, his voice regaining its authority. "But they won't be helpless. I'm going after him." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the horizon where Kane had disappeared. The setting sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood. The emptiness of the prairie was absolute. It was a fool's errand to track a ghost in a landscape that vast, but he had no choice. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was a reckoning. That night, Redemption huddled behind locked doors. The saloon was empty, its music silenced. A profound unease had settled over the town. In the sheriff's office, Jake planned his pursuit by the light of a single lantern. The glow cast long dancing shadows on the walls, turning the small room into a cage of his own making. He was preparing for a hunt, but he felt like the one being stalked. The first hint came just after midnight. The telegraph operator, a twitchy man named Perkins, burst into the office, his face ashen. He'd been trying to wire the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Worth for assistance. The line was dead. Not just down, but deliberately cut 10 miles east of town. They were isolated. Jake felt a grim satisfaction. This was Kane's work. Calculated, thorough. But it was also a mistake. It told Jake which direction they were headed. West was a feint. They were circling back east toward the more settled territories where they could disappear. Just as Perkins was leaving, he handed Jake a piece of paper. "This came through just before the line went dead, Sheriff. From a relay station near Haskell. Doesn't make much sense." Jake took the paper. The message was short, relayed from an unknown sender. It read, "The sparrow's feather is a heavy debt. The river runs red in Abilene. Remember." Jake's blood froze. It was a message meant only for him. Abilene. The sparrow. It was a reference to a raid years ago, a bloody affair he'd tried to bury deep in his memory. The sparrow was the nickname of a young outlaw. He had been forced to kill a boy barely older than his deputy. And the white feather? It had been the boy's calling card, always left at the scene of his crimes. The robbery, the locket, the cut telegraph line. It was all a prelude. Silas Kane wasn't just a bandit. He was a ghost from his past, resurrected to drag him back into the hell he thought he had escaped. The message was an invitation, a challenge scrawled in the ink of a dead man's memory. The hunt was on. Jake folded the paper, the sharp creases mirroring the grim set of his jaw. He knew now this wasn't just a pursuit. It was a pilgrimage into the heart of his own damnation, and he had to walk it alone. The town of Redemption awoke to a world severed from the outside. The dead telegraph line was more than an inconvenience. It was a symbol of their vulnerability. A thick blanket of paranoia descended, turning neighborly glances into suspicious stares. Every stranger was a potential threat, every gust of wind the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Silas Kane's raid had done more than empty the bank's safe. It had stolen the town's fragile sense of security. Jake moved through this miasma of fear with a singular, chilling purpose. He delegated the town's immediate protection to Billy, instructing him to organize a citizen watch. Give them something to do. Jake told him, his voice clipped. Idle hands and fearful minds are a dangerous combination. Shoot at shadows, and you'll end up hitting your neighbor. His focus was entirely on the hunt. The message from Kane had narrowed the trail from an entire continent to a single blood-soaked thread from his past. Abilene. He packed his saddlebags with grim efficiency, jerky, a full canteen, extra ammunition, and the worn map he knew by heart. He was stripping himself down to the essentials, becoming the man he used to be, a relentless tracker, a weapon of the federal government. The weary sheriff of redemption was receding, replaced by the ghost of U.S. Marshal Callahan. Before he left, he found himself walking toward the schoolhouse. He told himself it was to reassure Clara that he was handling the situation, that the town would be safe. But he knew it was more than that. Her quiet strength the day before had been a small point of light in his suffocating darkness. He found her standing outside with a group of parents, her presence a calming influence against their rising panic. She was explaining the importance of routine, of keeping the children's lives as normal as possible. Her logic and composure were a stark contrast to the town's hysteria. When she saw Jake approaching, she excused herself and met him by the water pump. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows. "You're leaving," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I have a trail," he confirmed, his words spare. "Is it dangerous?" she asked, her gaze steady and perceptive. She wasn't asking about the physical risks, but about the cost to him, to the man who was already so haunted. "The danger isn't what's in front of me," Jake replied, his voice low. "It's what I'm riding back into." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with the things they couldn't say. She saw the torment in his eyes, the weight of a past he was being forced to confront. He saw in her a deep, resonant empathy that asked for nothing in return. "My brother Thomas," she said suddenly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if the words themselves were fragile. "He was always running. From our father, from responsibility, from himself. I used to pray he'd find a quiet place to settle a town like this one. A place where he could stop running." She looked away toward the endless prairie. "I worry he never did. I worry he found the kind of trouble that doesn't let you go." It was the most she had ever shared about her past. Jake felt the unexpected weight of her confidence, a small precious trust offered in a world that had given them both reason to be distrustful. He didn't know why she was telling him this now, but he recognized the shape of her fear. It was the same fear that coiled in his own gut, that the past was a predator, and it was patient. "Some men can't stop running." Jake said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Some men are the trouble." And some, Clara countered, her eyes meeting his again, clear and unwavering, are the ones who have to face it. "Be careful, Sheriff. Not with them. With yourself." She reached out and briefly touched his arm. The contact was light, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through him, a spark of warmth in the cold emptiness Kane had left behind. He gave her a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked toward the livery stable without looking back. The isolation Kane had engineered was his first major obstacle. With no telegraph, Jake couldn't wire ahead for information or request aid from other lawmen. He was utterly alone, a single rider against an organized gang. He knew Kane was counting on this, hoping Jake's pride and desperation would drive him into a trap. Kane was testing him, trying to see if the old marshal was still inside the weary sheriff. As he rode east out of Redemption, the landscape unspooled before him, a vast canvas of cracked earth and hardy scrub. The sun was a hammer beating down relentlessly. But Jake barely noticed the heat, His mind was a maelstrom of memories, the name Abilene, a key that had unlocked a dozen sleeping demons. He remembered the gunfight in the dusty stockyards, the smell of gunpowder, and fear, the wide, surprised eyes of the boy they called the Sparrow, as he fell. Jake had been praised for his quick draw for ending a violent spree. But he had never forgotten the boy's face, the life extinguished before it had truly begun. He had believed that killing was a necessary part of his job, a grim calculus of justice. But the Sparrow's death had felt different. It had felt like a failure. Now that failure had returned, embodied by a man who moved like a phantom and knew his deepest secrets, Silas Kane wasn't just an outlaw. He was a judgment. And as Jake spurred his horse onward into the shimmering heat haze that distorted the horizon, he knew he was riding not toward a showdown, but toward a confession. The trail east was a descent into a past Jake had fought to bury. Silas Kane was not just fleeing. He was leaving a trail of carefully curated destruction, each stop a landmark in Jake's former life as a marshal. It was a cruel and brilliant strategy, forcing Jake to relive his history, to confront the man he had been at every turn. Kane wasn't just running. He was leading Jake on a tour of his own sins. His first stop was a burned-out husk that had once been a stagecoach relay station. Years ago, Jake had cornered a wanted man there, a shootout that had left 2 men dead. Now, as he walked through the charred ruins, he saw a single white feather placed carefully on the hearthstone, a mocking signature left in the ashes. Kane had been here. He knew. Days bled into a week. Jake pushed himself and his horse to their limits, sleeping in short, dreamless bursts and eating in the saddle. The red dust of the plains became a second skin. He rode through a ghost town where he'd once arrested a trio of counterfeiters, only to find the old jailhouse door swinging open. The words, "Debt paid," scrawled in charcoal across the wall. He was following a ghost who knew every step he had ever taken. With each stop, the psychological toll mounted. He was no longer just Sheriff Callahan of redemption. The lines blurred, and the hard-bitten U.S. Marshal he'd tried to shed re-emerged grimmer and more weary than before. The memories Kane was dredging up were not of triumphs, but of the morally gray compromises and violent necessities of his old job. He remembered the fear on men's faces, the pleas for mercy he had ignored, the blood on his hands that never seemed to wash away. Kane was showing him that the scales of justice he had once balanced so proudly were tipped with the weight of forgotten lives. Back in redemption, an uneasy quiet held sway. Clara Mayhew found herself watching the Eastern Road, an unconscious habit that had developed in Jake's absence. The town's fear had not abated, but her own anxiety was different. It was sharper, more personal. Her brief conversation with the sheriff had forged an unexpected connection. In his haunted eyes, she had seen a reflection of her own long-held grief for her brother Thomas. She threw herself into her work, the routine of the schoolhouse, a bulwark against uncertainty. One afternoon, while sorting through old books in the storeroom, she came across a small leather-bound trunk filled with her own keepsakes. She hadn't opened it in years. Her fingers, dusty from the books, trembled as she unlatched it. Inside, beneath a pressed wildflower and a faded ribbon, was a stack of letters tied with twine. They were the last letters she had received from Thomas. She sat on the floor of the dusty storeroom and began to read. The ink faded, but the words still alive with her brother's restless energy. He wrote of his travels, of working cattle drives and trying his hand at prospecting. His tone was boastful and full of youthful bravado. But underneath, Clara could read the loneliness and desperation. He was a boy trying to prove he was a man running from a past that shamed him. The last letter was different. It was dated from Abilene nearly 5 years ago. His tone was darker, angrier. He wrote of falling in with a new crowd, men who understood that the world takes from you, so you have to take back. He mentioned a man who had taken him under his wing, a man who had given him a new name, the Sparrow. He wrote of a plan, a big score that would set them up for life. He promised he would send for her, that they would start over somewhere new. It was the last she ever heard from him. A cold dread washed over Clara as she read the words. The Sparrow. It was an odd nickname, poetic and strange. She had never understood it. She folded the letter, her hands shaking, and placed it back in the trunk. The name echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the symphony of her grief. She had always imagined Thomas had met with an accident or simply decided to cut ties for good. She had never considered he might have found the very trouble he was running from. Meanwhile, Jake's hunt led him to a small, struggling ranch stead, a day's ride from Haskell. He found the family, a man, his wife, and 2 small children huddled inside, terrified. Their barn had been burned to the ground. Silas Kane's gang had ridden through 2 nights before. But they hadn't just robbed them. Kane had sat down at their dinner table and spoken to the rancher, a man named Elias. "He knew you, Marshal Elias," said, his voice trembling as he recounted the story to Jake. "He asked me if I remembered the time you saved my herd from rustlers right on this very land. He said you were a man who created debts wherever you went, and that he was the man who collected them." Kane hadn't taken much, just food and fresh horses. The destruction was the point. It was another message for Jake, another scar on the map of his past. But Elias gave him something else. He described one of Kane's men, a young rider, cocky and nervous, who had dropped a silver flask near the well. This was the break Jake needed. Kane's discipline was formidable, but his men were not infallible. A man with a silver flask was a man with vanity, and vanity made a man careless. Jake now had a specific target to look for within the gang. His pursuit intensified, driven by a new urgency. He was no longer just following Kane's ghosts. He was hunting a living man. He pushed on toward Haskell, a dusty waypoint town where outlaws and cattlemen drank at the same bars. He knew Kane would need supplies, and a man with a taste for silver flasks would likely find his way to a saloon. As he rode, Clara's face kept surfacing in his mind. Her quiet confession about her brother had struck a chord deep within him. He felt a fierce, protective urge, a desire to keep the ugliness of his world from touching the quiet dignity of hers. He thought of her in the schoolhouse, a place of order and hope, and it felt like the very thing he was fighting for, a future that was not defined by the violence of the past. It was a foolish thought for a man riding into a storm, but it was the first flicker of hope he had felt in a long time. The closer he got to Silas Kane, the more he realized he wasn't just fighting to reclaim a locket. He was fighting for the chance at redemption. Haskell was a town balanced on a razor's edge, and the kind of place where a man's life could be forfeit for a sideways glance. Dust from the street coated everything in a gritty film, and the air in the saloons was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and desperation. It was the perfect place for a man like Jake to disappear while hunting for someone else. He spent 2 days gathering intelligence, his presence quiet and unassuming. He was no longer a sheriff wearing a badge. He was just another weary rider passing through. He listened to the low murmur of conversations, buying drinks for drifters and gamblers, piecing together the movements of armed men passing through the territory. On the second night, his patience paid off. In the grimmiest saloon in town, he saw him, a young outlaw with nervous eyes and a silver flask peeking from his coat pocket, bragging to a saloon girl about a recent profitable bank job. Jake didn't confront him in the crowded room. He waited. He followed the young man when he stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness, heading for the stables. In the silent alleyway between the blacksmith and the livery, Jake moved. He was a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows, his movements swift and silent. The outlaw barely had time to register his presence before the barrel of Jake's Colt was pressed firmly against his temple. "We're going to have a conversation," Jake said, his voice a low, cold whisper that cut through the outlaw's drunken haze. He dragged the man, whose name was Cody, to an abandoned shed at the edge of town. Terror had sobered him completely. Under the cold, uncompromising pressure of Jake's interrogation, Cody's bravado crumbled, and the truth spilled out of him in a desperate torrent. "He's not like other men," Cody stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "Kane, he doesn't care about the money. It's all about you, Marshall. It's always been about you." Why, Jake's voice was dangerously calm. What's his name? His real name. Cody hesitated, and Jake cocked the hammer of his pistol. The click was deafening in the small space. "Kane isn't his real name," Cody blurted out. "It's Silas. Silas Mayhew." The name hit Jake like a physical blow, but it meant nothing to him. He'd never arrested a Silas Mayhew. "I don't know that name." "You don't know him," Cody whispered, a strange pity in his eyes. "But you knew his brother. His younger brother. The one they called the Sparrow." The world tilted on its axis. The saloon raid in Abilene. The young outlaw, barely a man, whose dying eyes had stared up at him with shock and disbelief. The Sparrow. For 5 years he had been a faceless ghost in Jake's nightmares, a symbol of a job gone wrong. Now he had a name. He was Silas Kane's brother. This wasn't a crime spree. It was a vendetta. A meticulously planned campaign of psychological warfare designed to dismantle Jake piece by piece before the final fatal blow. Every burned-out station, every taunting message, the theft of the locket, it was all an act of intimate personal revenge. Silas was making Jake walk the path of his brother's life, in reverse, forcing him to see the world through the eyes of the boy he had killed. The fight was no longer for the law or even for the memory of his wife. It was for his very soul. The guilt that Jake had suppressed for years erupted a toxic flood of shame and regret. He was no hero. He was the villain in another man's story, the architect of a family's destruction. "Where is he going?" Jake demanded, his voice raw. "Back," Cody gasped. "He's doubling back." He said the final act had to be on the stage where it all began. He's going back to redemption. A new, colder terror seized Jake, eclipsing his guilt. Redemption. Clara. He pictured her quiet strength, her gentle dignity, and the story she had told him of her own lost brother. My brother Thomas. The name hit him with the force of a stray bullet. Mayhew. Clara's surname. Thomas Mayhew. The boy he had killed. The Sparrow. Clara's long-lost brother. The pieces slammed into place with sickening clarity. Silas Kane, Silas Mayhew, was not just the Sparrow's brother. He was Clara's brother too. This was a horror beyond reckoning. Silas wasn't just returning to redemption to kill Jake. He was returning to destroy the one person who represented a chance at a future for him. He was going to use Clara, the sister he'd abandoned, and the sister of the man Jake had killed, as the final, cruelest weapon in his arsenal. Leaving Cody tied and gagged for the local law to find Jake, burst out of the shed and ran to the livery. He threw his saddle onto his exhausted horse, his movements frantic. He had to get back. He had to warn her. He had been so focused on the ghosts of his past that he hadn't seen the real danger gathering over the one person who made him want to live in the present. He spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, riding west into the darkness. The wind howled in his ears, carrying the whispers of the dead. He was riding not just against Silas Kane, but against fate itself, a cruel, tangled web of his own making. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey was the last good thing in his world. Silas Kane returned to redemption not with the thunder of a gang, but with the subtlety of a serpent. He arrived alone under the cover of a moonless night, a phantom slipping through the town's porous defenses. While Jake was racing back from Haskell, a man driven by dawning horror, Silas was already setting the final pieces of his cruel chessboard. He knew Jake would learn the truth. He was counting on it. The true torture wasn't in the knowing, but in the helplessness that followed. His target was the schoolhouse. It stood at the edge of town, isolated and vulnerable, a symbol of the very innocence Silas intended to obliterate. He moved with the patient certainty of a predator, his every step silent. Clara was working late grading papers by the light of a single oil lamp. The soft glow from the window was a beacon in the darkness, a fragile light he was about to extinguish. She heard a soft rap on the door, so gentle she almost dismissed it as the wind. When it came again, a polite but firm summons, she rose, a flicker of apprehension stirring within her. She opened the door to a tall man standing in the shadows, his face obscured. "Miss Mayhew," he asked, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was jarringly out of place on the frontier. "Yes," she said, her hand tightening on the doorknob. He stepped into the light, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. The face was older, harder, etched with lines of cruelty she did not recognize, but the eyes. The eyes were achingly familiar. They were her mother's eyes, her brother's eyes. "Thomas," she whispered the name, a fragile, hopeful prayer. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "He is gone. My name is Silas." He saw the confusion and hurt in her expression. Our father was fond of biblical names. He gave Thomas a new one when he cast him out. I chose my own. The shock was paralyzing. This was her brother. The boy she had grieved for returned as a stranger, a man who radiated a chilling malevolence. Before she could process the impossible truth, he was inside the door, clicking shut behind him. His movements were swift and precise. He showed her a small pistol tucked into his belt. "You will come with me, Clara," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The sheriff and I have an appointment, and you are the guest of honor." The news of Clara's abduction hit redemption like a physical blow. The schoolhouse was found empty the next morning, a single white feather left on her desk. The town's paranoia erupted into full-blown panic. Billy, overwhelmed and out of his depth, could do little more than try to maintain order as the fragile community threatened to tear itself apart with fear and accusations. Jake arrived 2 hours later, his horse lathered, and near collapse, his face a mask of grim exhaustion. He didn't need to be told what had happened. He saw the empty schoolhouse and the feather, and the full weight of his failure crashed down on him. Silas had outmaneuvered him completely. He had turned Jake's own past and Clara's into a cage, and now she was the one trapped inside. A message was waiting for him, nailed to the door of his office. It was from Silas, his handwriting, an elegant, sharp script. "Hey, Sheriff. The performance requires a fitting stage. The old church at sundown, a congregation of 2. The bell will toll for the final act. Come alone, or the woman who shares your sin will pay for it in full." The old church stood on a hill overlooking the town, its steeple a skeletal finger pointing toward the sky. It had been abandoned for years after a fire had gutted its interior, leaving it a hollowed-out shell. It was the perfect place for a final confrontation, a desecrated sanctuary for a battle over damned souls. As the afternoon waned, the sky began to change. The clear blue faded to a sickly yellow-gray as a massive dust storm, a red-walled monster, rolled in from the west. The wind picked up, howling like a banshee, whipping sand and debris through the streets. The townsfolk sealed themselves in their homes, the storm a fitting expression of the terror that had gripped them. For Jake, it was an omen. The world was being scoured clean, ready for a final judgment. He prepared in the tense silence of his office. He checked his Colt, loading each chamber with deliberate care. He wasn't thinking about strategy or tactics anymore. This was beyond the law. This was a penance he had to pay. He looked at the empty space on his desk where the locket used to be, and for the first time, he understood. Silas hadn't just taken it to hurt him. He had taken it because Eleanor represented an innocent past, a life untouched by the blood he had spilled. Silas was systematically stripping him of everything, leaving him with nothing but his guilt before the end. As the sun began to dip below the churning wall of dust, casting an apocalyptic orange glow over the world, Jake walked out into the gale. The wind tore at him, stinging his face with sand, but he walked on his steps steady. He was a man walking toward his own gallows, and his only prayer was that he could save the innocent woman he had dragged there with him. The abandoned church loomed against the blood-orange sky, its burned-out windows like vacant eyes. The sandstorm raged, a physical manifestation of the chaos that had been unleashed. The wind screamed through the broken steeple, a mournful dirge for all that had been lost. Inside the scene was a tableau from a nightmare. Flickering lanterns cast long, distorted shadows that danced like devils on the soot-stained walls. A fire roared in the old hearth, its light illuminating Silas Kane, who stood near the ruined altar. Clara was there, tied to a wooden support beam, her face pale, but her expression defiant. Jake entered through the gaping doorway, his duster whipping around him. The sand crunched under his boots. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other across the cavernous space, the howling wind and the only sound. Sheriff Callahan Silas began his voice, calm and clear above the storm's fury. "Welcome. I am so pleased you could attend the final sermon." He gestured around the ruined church. "A fitting place, don't you think, a house of redemption for a man with so much to atone for?" "Let her go, Silas." Jake's voice was a low growl, stripped of everything but resolve. "This is between you and me." Silas laughed, a sound as cold and empty as the building around them. "Oh, but that is where you are wrong. This has always been about her, too. She is the centerpiece of it all, the perfect tragic nexus of our shared history." He walked over to Clara, trailing a gloved finger along her jaw. She flinched, but did not cry out. "Did you ever tell him about our brother Clara, about Thomas?" Clara's eyes darted to Jake, confusion and a new terrible fear dawning within them. What does he have to do with this? Everything. Silas purred, turning his attention back to Jake. He began to pace before the fire, his movements theatrical, his voice resonating with the fervor of a mad preacher. "You see, Sheriff, you rode into Abilene 5 years ago as a righteous arm of the law. You cornered a young outlaw, a boy they called the Sparrow. My brother, Thomas Mayhew." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. He watched as the confirmation of the truth struck Clara, her eyes widening in horror, her gaze locking onto Jake's. The betrayal, the shock, the impossible agony of it, it was all there. He wasn't a hardened criminal, Silas continued, his voice rising with venomous passion. He was a scared boy swept up in things he didn't understand. But you didn't see a boy. You saw a target. You shot him down in the street without a second thought. He drew on me. Jake said, his own voice hollow. The justification felt like a lie in his own mouth. He was terrified. Silas roared, his composure finally cracking. "And you were the famous Marshal Callahan, the man who never missed. You killed him. You took the last of my family from me." He stopped pacing and turned to face Jake, his eyes burning with a grief that had metastasized into pure hatred. "So I swore an oath on his unmarked grave. I would not just kill you. I would unmake you. I would take everything you valued, everyone you cared for. I took your past, he said, tapping his coat pocket where the locket now resided. And now I will take your future. He pointed at Clara. And the exquisite irony, the final beautiful twist of the knife, is that the woman you've turned to for solace is the sister of the boy you murdered. You have fallen for the one person in this world who should despise you more than any other. The revelation hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her breath hitched in a sob, her face a canvas of disbelief and shattering heartbreak. She looked at Jake, her eyes pleading for him to deny it, but his silence was a confession. The man who had shown her kindness, the man she had begun to trust, was the killer of her brother. Now Silas said, drawing his gleaming Colt, "The reckoning." The grandfather clock in the corner of the saloon, miraculously spared by the fire, began to chime its bells, marking the hour of sundown. The fight began. It was not a classic duel. It was a brutal, desperate brawl in the flickering, hellish light. Gunshots exploded, their sound swallowed by the storm. Wooden pews shattered under the impact of bullets. Jake dived behind the ruined altar, the air thick with splintered wood and cordite. Silas was a formidable opponent, fast and precise. But Jake was fighting with the strength of a man, with nothing left to lose but someone else's life. He moved with a feral grace the old marshal awakened. He saw an opportunity as Silas reloaded. Jake charged, tackling him. They crashed to the floor, rolling through the dust and debris. It became a battle of fists and knives, of grunts and curses. Jake fought for Clara's life. Silas fought for the memory of his brother. In the midst of their struggle, a burning log rolled from the hearth, setting a pile of dry timbers ablaze. Flames began to lick up the walls, the fire roaring in harmony with the wind outside. The church was becoming an inferno. Jake managed to disarm Silas, but Silas pulled a knife. He lunged, and Jake felt a searing pain in his side. He staggered back, his hand coming away wet with blood. Silas smiled, his face illuminated by the growing fire. "It ends now, Callahan." As Silas lunged again for the killing blow, Jake saw it, the silver locket fallen from Silas's pocket during their struggle, lying on the floor near Clara. In that split second, everything crystallized. He was not fighting for his past or his future. He was fighting for this one desperate moment. With a final surge of adrenaline, he sidestepped Silas's attack, grabbed a fallen burning timber from the floor, and swung it with all his might. The blow caught Silas across the head. He crumpled to the floor unconscious. The fire was consuming the church, the roar deafening. Jake, clutching his bleeding side, stumbled over to Clara and frantically cut her ropes with Silas's knife. He pulled her to her feet. She was shaking, her face streaked with tears and soot, her eyes filled with an unbearable mixture of gratitude and anguish. "We have to go," he rasped, smoke filling his lungs. He grabbed the locket from the floor and pushed her toward the door. As they burst out into the raging sandstorm, a massive burning beam from the steeple crashed down, engulfing the spot where they had just stood. The church and Silas Kane were consumed by the flames. Jake shoved the locket into Clara's hand, then collapsed to his knees, the world dissolving into a vortex of pain sand and the roar of the fire. The sandstorm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured and unnervingly still. The fire that had consumed the church smoldered under a bruised purple sky, a funeral pyre for the ghosts of redemption. Jake survived, pulled from the brink by the town's cynical but capable doctor. He awoke in his own bed, his side stitched and burning, the events in the church, a fever dream of fire and devastating truth. Redemption was safe. Silas Kane and his vendetta were reduced to ash. But for Jake, the hardest battle was yet to come. The physical wound was nothing compared to the chasm that had opened between him and Clara. He found her a few days later, sitting on the porch of the schoolhouse, staring out at the plains. She held his locket in her hands, its silver surface dark with soot. The silence between them was vast and heavy, filled with the ghosts of two brothers, one she had loved and one he had killed. He stood before her not as a sheriff, but as a man stripped of all pretense. He did not offer excuses or justifications. He told her everything. He told her about Abilene, about the fear and confusion of the gunfight, about the young face that had haunted him for 5 years. He confessed his guilt, his regret, and the profound shame of knowing he was the cause of her deepest sorrow. His voice was raw, breaking under the weight of his confession. "I didn't know he was your brother, Clara." He finished, his voice a ragged whisper. "It doesn't change what I did. But I need you to know I would give anything to take it back. Not for my sake, for yours." Clara listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he was done, she looked down at the locket in her hands, then back up at him, her eyes clear and filled with a grief so deep it seemed bottomless. "My brother made his choices," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He chose to run. He chose that life. I spent years mourning the boy he was, and I never knew the man he became. You have shown me that man." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "And I have seen the man you are now, not the one you were 5 years ago. I see a man who carries the weight of his past every single day. I see a man who was willing to die to save me." She stood up and walked toward him. She opened his hand and placed the locket in his palm, her fingers brushing against his. "This belongs to you," she said. "It is a memory of love, not of death." She looked him directly in the eye. "Grief is a heavy burden, Jake. I will not add hatred to it. I cannot. Forgiving you is the only way I can forgive him." Her forgiveness was not an absolution, but something far more powerful, an acceptance of the flawed, broken people they both were, and a choice to look forward rather than back. It was a gift of grace that Jake knew he had not earned, and it humbled him to his very core. Weeks later, on a clear, cool morning, they stood together in the town cemetery. It was a quiet place, dotted with simple wooden crosses and weathered stones. They stopped before 2 graves. One was new, marked with a simple cross for Eleanor, whose body lay in a distant plot, but whose spirit now had a place in redemption. The other was an unmarked space Jake had chosen to represent Thomas Mayhew. Jake knelt. He took the old tarnished U.S. Marshal's badge from his pocket, the symbol of the man he used to be, and placed it on the ground where Thomas lay. It was a surrender, an apology, a final letting go of the violent pride that had defined his past. Clara knelt beside him. She laid a single resilient prairie wildflower on the same spot. It was an act of remembrance, of peace, and of farewell to the brother she had lost twice. They rose together. The sun was warm on their faces, and a gentle breeze whispered through the tall grass. The pain of their pasts would always be a part of them, scars on their souls, but they would no longer be defined by it. Clara reached out and took Jake's hand. Her touch was not one of passion, but of quiet solidarity, a promise of a future to be built slowly and carefully on the ruins of what came before. They turned away from the graves and walked back toward the town, and their shadows stretching long behind them, 2 survivors who had found in each other not a cure for their sorrows, but the strength to carry them together.